Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Attention class, please. Attention, all you youngsters. Thank you for coming today. Welcome to the Contemporary Issues Sunday School class, where we talk about social issues from a Christian perspective. And we are pleased today to have attorney Jeff Klaus with us, longtime retired attorney, recovering attorney. Longtime St. Andrew member and teacher in the education department here on many topics. And we are so glad to have him talk about today, give us a little refresher on the US Constitution and what the current challenges to the Constitution are. There was a good one that I wondered if you all saw this week in the news with the congressional hearing on immigration, and the Secretary of the Homeland Security Department was before Congress, and one of the Congress people asked her, Kristi Noem, what habeas corpus was in the Constitution. And she said that's the constitutional right the president has to deport anybody that he wants. And the Congress lady said, I'm sorry, that's not correct. It's actually the opposite of that. It is the right of someone that's accused to go before a judge and have a judicial review. So it's not just one politician that's trying to charge you with something. And so I thought, this is the perfect time for us to talk about the Constitution today. What it actually said, because a lot of our leaders don't even know what it says. And many of them today, many of us today in America, maybe don't even agree with the Constitution. If it was up for a vote, Jeff, maybe a lot of people wouldn't agree with what's in it and might not vote for it. Do you think that's possible?
Oh, I think that's very likely. Even at the time when it was enacted, it was very controversial. And so they had debates. A lot of you have probably heard of the Federalist Papers that were penned by Hamilton and Madison. Those were a campaign by them to sway people in favor of the Constitution. And so it's a very eloquent, well-written document. But yeah, it's been also very controversial.
Okay, before we get into it, our usual announcements. Want to welcome our Zoomers here. Nice to have you here. Please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen when you're not speaking so we can keep down the background noise. We've got about 10 or 12, looks like today. Very good. And we are recording this for future playback on YouTube for those who couldn't be here today. And we have any other announcements, things we want to plug, classes going on. I want to give a prayer for Alice and Ron and their son-in-law Nash, who had a stroke this week. And we hope that everything goes well in recovery for Nash and for your family. You bet. And go ahead.
Did you bring the cards that I gave you for?
No, I'm sorry, I forgot to bring the cards for Vacation Bible School, senior Bible School. We'll send it, we'll give them for next week.
Well, we want to plug that. It's July 11th.
And 11, 12.
Oh, you got
It's a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah.
And it'll be in the morning from 9 to 1. Okay, and lots to offer. And we have a lot of fun things going on. So it's just a regular VBS for seniors. So
$12 a day or $30.
$12 a day or $30 for all 3 days. And there'll be like a refreshment, there'll be a lunch. And there'll be some craft
yoga.
classes, yoga classes, there'll be
Really?
talks from Rev Mark, Rev Amy, and Rev Harry. And so we've got a lot of interesting things planned, so we hope you'll plan to attend. Okay.
Very
Good. Okay, with that, I want to leave plenty of time for Jeff to present, and he has a few slides. And you want to take comments during your presentation? If somebody has a comment or
Yeah,
question? Okay,
we
just
want to
raise
make
your
it very interactive, so.
Okay. Very good. Let me hit my share screen here so we can share with our Zoomers. So many buttons to push. And we have technology going.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Okay, Jeff, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody. It's always fun to come here, whether just participating in the audience or presenting a topic. So I'm excited to share this one. The Constitution has always been a favorite subject of mine. I wouldn't be a good retired attorney or practicing attorney if I didn't have a disclaimer in the beginning. And my disclaimer is that I am not a constitutional law attorney. There are really very few that are actually experts about the Constitution. And there's so many different opinions about it, but it's been kind of an interest of mine. So I've done quite a bit of reading about it. And whenever issues come up, I try to keep myself a little bit up to date. So what we're going to do today is kind of do a flyby or a high level review of the Constitution and kind of what it is, what it's meant to be, and a little bit about its structure and purpose. And then we'll hit on at least 4 topics that I think are in the news now and do a quick kind of issue identification discussion about what are the constitutional issues with that subject matter. And feel free to raise your hand with questions. I would like to see if we can hit on all the topics, but if we don't, that's fine. Or if we get sidetracked by something that's interesting and worthwhile, that's great too. So first of all, why don't we hit the next slide? And that's my outline, which I just kind of summarized. And so that some of the issues that we will hit on are birthright citizenship, impoundments, which is a president not spending money allocated or authorized by Congress, term limitations, and just a quick blurb about Christian nationalism in the Constitution and what kind of constitutional implications there are for that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So first of all, I thought we'd just start with a real brief discussion about what is the Constitution. It's the founding document of our country, and so it is a founding document in that regard. And it sets up the structure of how our government is to work. And we all kind of have some basic knowledge of that. I'm sure all of us of our era, had civics class and read the Constitution in high school and before. So first of all, it's kind of a governance document. It's what the founders established to create the United States and the mechanics of how our government is to work. But there's also a lot of features in it that we consider to be substantive law, especially in like the Bill of Rights and some of the other portions of the Constitution itself, and other amendments that set forth kind of the law of the land. And we test and hold up all other laws, state and federal, against the Constitution to see whether or not it's viable or whether it's we call it constitutional or unconstitutional. And it's also kind of a statement of ideals. What's important in our country and what are the values that we have as a group of people banded together as a nation. So that kind of is some of the sort of purposes or ways to think of it. It's really all 3 of those things and more. So one of the structures that's we've heard most about is that the Constitution has separation of powers. And the founders were very, very wary of concentration of power. The whole birth of our nation came as a rebellion against tyranny. And they understood that if you had too much power in one place, that it could become very dangerous and you would lose the ability to have freedoms and liberties that each of the people wanted to enjoy and retain. So in addition to the separation of those powers, you had to have them balance. So we have the balance of powers. So they tried very carefully in the first three articles of the Constitution to give the executive or our president certain powers, our legislature certain powers, and our judiciary certain powers. And those were meant to balance each other out so that no one could, one department of government could dominate the other two. Kind of a, you know, keep you honest, I guess, in that thing. So we call that the tripartite structure of government.
It was a unique experience in government, because prior to that time, government had been led by the kings, queens, potentates, and here was a government by the people, for the people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think our founding fathers had a lot of examples to draw upon where these three branches of government had evolved or kind of come to have certain powers. And they saw that by balancing the powers between those three, they could, normally the executive power, president or a king or a dictator was the kind of the rule throughout history. And so there was always has been an evolution of a judiciary, judges, people to decide disputes and that kind of thing. They took each of these elements that were out there and put them right alongside of each other. Let's go on to the next slide, a couple real quickly. Legislative power is set out in Article 1, and that's the power to make the laws of the land, to create the budget, spend the money, tax and spend. Next slide. The executive branch is, we know that now is, that's the president, and that's the power to execute all the laws, to command the armed forces, and to administer the government, basically. And currently, right now, we're seeing a situation where we see a disproportionate amount of power probably in the executive branch compared to what we traditionally have seen. And lastly, next slide is just representative of the judicial power. And if anyone has any questions about those, but I'll just briefly mention the current, what I think is sort of the current reality right now, and this is subject to different debate, but go ahead, the next slide. And I think this has been going on for quite a while, because I think we've had kind of a weak Congress for a number of years, mostly just because of divided politics and kicking the can down the road, that it's created. Congress has not been able to assert itself the way that it had in years past and over traditional times. So power has tipped to the executive branch. And the executive branch does include in it, all the administrative agencies which administer the law. And so there's a big debate. We've talked about it in other classes where those various agencies have certain rule-making power and power to do things that a legislature might do. And the argument is whether it's been proper over time for the legislature to have delegated so much power to these administrative agencies, which now do that quite frequently. The flip side of that is if you kept all those agencies under the legislature and had the power still under the legislative branch, then it would be impinging on the executive branch in executing those laws. So either way you would go with it, it's going to be a problematic situation. But the way we have evolved is the executive branch controls those administrative agencies and therefore then can control the rulemaking and policy implementation. I can't think of the word.
What are your thoughts on birthright citizenship.
Well, we're gonna get to that specifically. We're gonna get to that specifically. Right now, we're zooming in on where we're at on the Constitution and what it is. That's actually the first one of the little current event topics because I think it's pretty far reaching. So, but just to finish out this topic, I don't know if any of the rest of you have noticed it, but over time, it seems to me that we have over relying on judicial system to resolve disputes that are really political or legislative. So we get judges forced to resolve these disputes that our legislature should be enacting laws on or amending laws and clarifying what they meant. And so that's put an undue strain on the judiciary. I think that it's not really equipped, well suited maybe to resolve all of those disputes that it's been doing. And the other thing it's not on this list, but I think it's an earmark of why we're seeing a tipping of, or why we're seeing Congress so ineffective is we see more and more states having to take the lead one way or the other on emerging issues and topics of the day. California has a lot of laws about environmental and employment, and a lot of other states have had to do that too, because our federal Congress just cannot seem to get the job done on those things. So before we move on to topics, just any other questions of kind of our Constitution and where we're at? Steve had a question before we started about if anyone thinks there maybe is part of the Constitution that's obsolete or that we would want to amend and do away with. And one thing we were talking about is the Electoral College. And my opinion is that it still serves a useful purpose of, again, balancing the power between less populous states and more populous states, and that I'm not quite ready to abandon it. Although it does kind of result in some quirky outcomes sometimes. Quirky, my word for it. There's another question here.
I just wondered if you heard Elizabeth Warren this past week, that she was addressing the same thing about the fact that the legislative branch was not doing their job. And I don't remember who she was addressing, but she was really, really adamant about the fact that the legislative branch needs to become more vocal and start doing their work.
Absolutely. And that's been my opinion for quite a while, that they've become ineffective. And another little earmark, just to, bit of evidence to prove that point is over the last umpteen presidents, well, not umpteen, but last series of presidents, we've had more and more executive orders.
Oh, yeah.
And now we're just, floating in executive orders. And I think that's evidence that Congress is not legislating. Question here?
Yeah, I don't know if you'll address this in the slides to come, but I was surprised when I heard that our current president doesn't know if he should uphold the Constitution. My job is on the floor. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I think for our current president, kind of everything's up for debate.
Yeah.
Everything's up for renegotiation. In the back?
Back to electoral college, doesn't the Senate representing two senators for each state, regardless of their population, doesn't that take care of the issue of taking care of the smaller states? And then on top of that, then we add the electoral college, which seems to give them even more power. So we've already made that adjustment with the Senate.
Well, those are both two separate factors that were supposed to allow small states a bigger say than their population might otherwise suggest. And so on that same topic.
Of the two, the Senate is the worst situation because we have the 9 most populous states with 50% of the population. That gives us 82 senators, I think, for half the population and 18 senators for the others. That is so incredibly disproportionate that it's pathetic, to put it bluntly.
Well, and on the other hand, you could say we are a federal government and we have, each state has a certain degree of sovereignty of itself, like a own entity. And if it doesn't have some mechanism to give it a little bigger say, those states have no say. They're be totally outvoted every time by the bigger, more populous states. And if that's where all the people are, maybe that's where the policy should shift. But you can sort of see both sides of it. You know, if you were a small, less populous state, would you ever want to join an organization? And I had a lot of examples of this with corporate structure where I have multiple partners wanting to be in business together. And one guy says, well, I'm the main guy. I have all the money. I'm investing 80% and you two guys each get 10%. And basically you just have a dictatorship where the one majority owner of the business can tell the other two what's gonna happen, whether they like it or not. Over here, you.
Yeah, when the founding fathers created the Constitution, did they model after other countries? Or was there any historical basis that they created our Constitution in comparison to?
Yeah, that's a great question, that I don't know a detailed answer to. I do know they drew upon many antecedents that were there, the Magna Carta, the Parliament in Great Britain, Roman law. They had the example of Greek republics. It's always been kind of my understanding, though, that this very elegant, simple framework was kind of brand new, or it was at least the better mousetrap, if you want to put it that way.
Hey Jeff, I have a Swiss brother-in-law, and he says that our government's based on Swiss. And they
Okay,
have well, they have the triple, the
yeah.
different parts, and I'd never really thought about that. They do have a legislature and an executive, it's like, okay.
Well, those three branches were not unique to Switzerland or to the United States. That was in existence in multiple places, but I don't know where anyone so intentionally balanced the three out the way they did in our Constitution. But I've never seen a reference to Switzerland, but yeah, sounds interesting. Yeah.
Susie.
All these executive orders that, Trump keeps making up, are they law now? A lot of them are against the Constitution and it has to go or not a Constitution, but Congress already enacted them. So do all these have to go back to Congress for them to change it, or is it law now?
Well, I think when they're issued by the president, they're kind of presumptively the law until they get challenged or preempted by Congress. Congress could always enact a law very specific that spelled out exactly what should happen in that particular arena. But what's really, Congress is kind of just rolled over and not really doing much. In terms of years past or examples the way I've heard commentators say, they're not fighting for their own turf. They're part of the tripartite balance of power. They're not even just fighting to protect their level of power for the sake of keeping that power. They've kind of ceded it over to the executive in a lot of ways. But what's really happening is if someone doesn't like the executive orders or they're questionable, they're being litigated. And again, that's what I was referencing earlier to the legislative branch is now having to go toe to toe with the executive branch and set forth, what is constitutional and not versus what is not constitutional. Plus, you then get in the mix that, of course, if you don't like what the judges are deciding, you say they're activist judges trying to assert their own agenda. And if you like them, then you say, of course, they're just and interpreting the Constitution and upholding our American way of life. Steve.
or to see the whole executive order thing as being a reflection of the fact that Congress is not doing their job. I
Yeah,
mean, going back, everybody's blaming Trump and the number is astronomical, but Obama did basically the same thing. That he issued a whole flurry of executive orders. And then finally, the next president can override anything that Trump does with an executive order.
right.
So it's like a Band-Aid. They don't get a permanent, he doesn't get a permanent cure because he hasn't gone the legislative route. It's like a shortcut.
Well, that's right. And as I mentioned earlier, I think, that the number and frequency of using executive orders in presidents over time has shown the same corresponding reduction in the effectiveness of our federal legislature. And so, yeah, they can be overridden, they can be overruled by the courts. What's kind of unique, and I don't know if any of you agree with this, but it seems like Trump has gone through with some very aggressive executive orders that it's going to be hard to undo because he's dismantled certain agencies and functions and laying off so many people and defunding things. And we're going to talk about impoundments for a minute at some point. What are we doing time-wise? Yeah.
11 o'clock.
As a taxpaying citizen and a veteran, I don't like what the Supreme Court has done with presidential powers,
And specifically, what are you referring?
Well, it was just recently that they gave him, I thought, almost limited powers. He's not a king.
Well, they have undone, or they have granted presidential immunity, which is yet to be fleshed out exactly how that's going to work out. So I think that's certainly would embolden an executive, but they have undone regulatory power and done away with the Chevron doctrine a while back, which kind of also throws a lot of rulemaking things back into the own court's power. So the court now has the power to second guess administrative rulemaking and regulations. So yeah, I mean it's kind of a tough situation too, because and this is a good chance maybe to talk about the courts, because we're at kind of a tipping point with the courts. Let's see if the next slide. I kind of introduction here is maybe one of the problems we have right now is there's maybe too much money involved in our political system. So not sure where I had us. I thought I had.
That's where we were.
Yeah, okay. So I thought I'd mention right now, and this since we're talking about the courts, we're at a tipping point with the interpretation of the Constitution. When the nation was brand new and we had a Supreme Court, we didn't really have any tradition of how to interpret the Constitution and what it meant. We had quite a robust debate at the constitutional conventions, and there were all the writings in the Federalist Papers that I mentioned. But the very first case on that was Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court justice at that time recognized and claimed for the judicial department the right to say what law is in the United States, and the right to interpret the Constitution, and then to also interpret other law as whether or not it's constitution. So Supreme Court claimed and has held that power as the last word on that subject ever since. And a lot of the stuff in that very first case about how to interpret the Constitution has been passed on as a tradition for a century, more than a century and a half. And they kind of call that the traditional way of interpreting the Constitution. And it focuses on a lot of things, you know, if you start with the language, of course, and what does the words mean? Are the words ambiguous, which often they are? What's the contextual nature of the situation? What's the purpose of the law that you're interpreting? What's the purpose of the Constitution? And how do you keep it workable? And that's a term used in Marbury versus Madison, is that, you know, the Constitution is supposed to be an enduring document, workable throughout the centuries for us to govern ourselves with. And
I hear a large but in there.
so here's the but. Since you queued me up, we have now a growing number of legal scholars and jurists that have adopted what they call textualism or originalism, in which they try to make it more formulaic and go back on just what the words say. But if you have to go beyond that, we're going to look at what they were meant, what were they meant at the time they were written, to the people that would have read that then and understood it then.
She's kind of like Bible interpretation. You stick with what was then, or do you interpret what would be acceptable now? Do we
Well, and so
look
that,
at it like how Jesus would look at it today with knowing our current science and cultural understandings? Or
and maybe those are related, that people are, because that's a new thing too in the Bible. And this is a fairly newish way of looking at the Constitution. Which also puts a greater emphasis on historical facts and traditions earlier related, and less emphasis on the traditions that have followed since then. You know, we have 200 years of history of the constitutional practice and the evolution of our government and the way it works, that that originalists tend to not want to put very much emphasis on that. One weird little example, and I won't spend much time on it, is interpreting when presidential can make appointments to government offices during recesses of Congress. Normally, Congress has to approve appointments of those high-level officials, but the president can ramrod those through during a recess. And of course, when the Constitution was originally made and Congress originally formed, they didn't have recesses the way they have them now. It's changed. Congressional rules have changed, and the recesses they have are shorter, the official ones, but then they have a lot of little dinky ones, and so do you interpret the constitutional power for the president in the way that Congress has recesses now, or the way that it did when it was originally formed? And it seems a little backwards to go back and emphasize that, but go ahead.
My understanding was that effectively they're not going into recess, that they're maintaining the session. You know, with just a couple of officers or something.
Well, they normally have the recesses
They're giving
between each
recesses.
term of Congress, and those aren't necessarily too long, but then they have multiple kinds of shorter recesses, and some of them aren't even really sort of official recesses, and I forget the word, it's like
Well, what they're
pro
doing,
hoc recess.
by not going into recess, then the president can make a recess appointment. And so they're permanently not in recess.
Well, and that's the debate that the Supreme Court has to figure out, is when they're doing those short pro hoc recesses, does the president have power to make appointments during those kind of recesses, or only intra-term recesses, or intra-session, or intersession recesses? And we were spending way more time on that, but than I meant to, but you could see how in the weeds everything gets. But my main point was that I think traditional, or the originalism tends to ignore our current context and our current situation a little too much.
Yeah.
But they could argue probably persuasively that a reason why that's good. Anything else just on the general thing, and then we'll move into birthright citizenship since that's on the list and we already had someone raise the question. So how many people know what that is?
So we think, why don't you define it for us?
Okay, well, before, when the Constitution was originally initiated or adopted, citizenship was white landowning males, it wasn't universal. And over time, our understanding of that has dramatically changed, but the birthright citizenship we're talking about now is stated in the 14th Amendment, which is one of the amendments that's post-Civil War, and it was enacted along with the 13th Amendment, which emancipated slaves. And it granted, and I'll just read it, it's very short, a lot of these are, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the citizen and the state wherein they reside. And so it seems pretty simple. If you're born in a state and the United States, you're a citizen of both. There's one little clause in there that I don't know if you picked up on it when I was reading it. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a little wiggle room. And I haven't heard that actually argued yet, but I suspect that that's going to be a key clause that the administration is going to use to say that immigrants here in the United States aren't fully subject to our jurisdiction because they're here illegally, or they're here unlawfully. And so that has never been the interpretation applied to that clause. But that's kind of one of the only wiggle rooms I can see in it. Traditionally, that clause has been applied to diplomats and diplomats' children, because the foreign diplomats in the United States have diplomatic immunity or are not subject to the laws of the United States. So they're kind of one of the exceptions that clause was designed for, and traditionally that clause is what that meant. And now you might argue that clause is broader than that. But another textualist argument might be too, is that at the time the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was to ensure the rights of freed slaves to be citizens and to clear up that. So there's no mistake that these freed slaves are not citizens, they're citizens, and it says so in the 14th Amendment. But it shouldn't be interpreted broader than that because there was no historical antecedent or tradition prior to that time. And no one at the time thought it meant, if you just happened to be on vacation from France and had children here, that those should be citizens or anything else. So that might be part of the argument too.
Which is the Trump concern today, right? That immigrants can come over and have children here and then move back, and the children would retain their citizenship, would get benefits here. And so some people just come to do that.
So we have an executive order basically declaring that birthright citizenship does not apply, or sort of via administrative fiat repealing the 14th Amendment.
I think we have an illegal president now, because it says anyone that has engaged in an insurrection is disqualified from being a president.
Well, we haven't litigated that yet either. So coming back to the 14th Amendment, does anyone, and maybe you want to scroll through a couple of those back and forth about those, rewriting the Constitution. Any thoughts about birthright citizenship? Has anyone ever suspected or heard any other interpretation other than, I'm going to get to you, that is other than everyone? You right here in front.
You read that first line that says born here or naturalized.
What's the next?
So.
or naturalized.
Yes, so I'm naturalized.
Yeah,
So does that mean that if that is canceled out? That naturalized citizens also will be canceled to leave?
well, if you remember me reading it, it doesn't have the term birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. That term is what the label kind of that we apply to it. And so you're not birthright citizenship, you're naturalized citizenship. So the executive order does not seem to address that. So you can go.
I'll harbor you.
Go home to Canada.
So yeah, I don't think that executive order implicates naturalized citizens. The executive order is targeted at birthright citizenship today. Yeah, until tomorrow. Good point.
So are they intending that goes back to everybody that was, a birthright?
I don't think anybody's explained that. No
Yeah.
one said
I
what.
mean, is it going forward?
Just, yeah.
Everybody.
Well, that makes it sort of an ex post facto law that goes back to the original, and those are supposed to not be favored or constitutional, but so most laws are supposed to work forward, which would have a different impact
Yeah.
on where we're at now if we're trying to stop immigration going forward and then deal with what we've got on the ground now. That's a much different thing than putting in limbo all the people that were born here. I mean, that's how I understood my citizenship, because I was born in the United States. I was never naturalized. My parents were born in the United States. All of us were either born here and so, I mean, who does it apply to? That's not spelled out in the executive order at all.
What does naturalized mean?
Well, there's a process through legislation, and I'm not sure I'm gonna give you a sophisticated definition of it. But there's a process through immigration acts whereby you can apply for citizenship. You get vetted, you have to take a test, and then you become a citizen through that, or you pay $5 million and you. Something like, so that's what a naturalized citizenship is. My understanding is that's the process of, through application and process.
You have $5 million.
So.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It
Mitch.
seems to me that words have meanings. And what you read from the 14th Amendment is fairly clear that if you're born here, that you're a citizen, or if you're naturalized, you're a citizen. There's no asterisk.
Nope.
There's no,
Exactly.
there are no escape clauses from that. And it's been a while, but I did learn about.
You know this
personal
stuff.
Jurisdiction. And if a person is physically present in the United States, they are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So if you were born here, you have the obligation to be subject to the laws and regulations of the United States. We're making it way too complicated.
That's 100% my view on how that's gonna come down. I think the Supreme Court is gonna decide exactly that. And there's no precedent out there that suggests otherwise. But that's not to say that the precedent that is out there won't get ignored, won't get considered, won't be debated. I think there's nothing a slam dunk when it comes to constitutional interpretation, but that's, I kind of want to use that term, but I don't know.
Mitch is a retired attorney too, recovering attorney. We've got about 14 minutes left.
Let's move on.
Jeff, can I ask you a quick question? I know we want to move on
and cover things, but while I'm thinking of it, one of the key questions today is what happens if the Supreme Court orders something and Trump decides to just ignore and not follow the directive from the court?
Well, that's what Abraham Lincoln did.
Well, was somebody else, which president was
Let me
it?
bring the most
Andrew
egregious
Jackson.
example. Andrew Jackson, the state of Georgia and its particularly white property owners were seizing the property of the Cherokee Indians. The Supreme Court said that Cherokees had legal right to their lands. There was no reason to seize it away from them. Andrew Jackson just said, Supreme Court, tough luck. Send them on the Trail of Tears. Perhaps as many as 20% of the thousands of Cherokees that were sent on the Trail of Tears died. And a case where a tyrant acting president blew away the Supreme Court.
Appears to be no enforcement mechanism to force the president to obey a Supreme Court order. Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the Supreme Court the power to override that, or what do you want to say? Just supersede the president or invoke the military.
Yeah.
That's what the constitutional crisis that people reference in the news, and I don't know the answer to that, because what you would hope is that other branches of the government step in to uphold the integrity of that, or other people supporting the Supreme Court chime in, public opinion, protest. We're gonna get to that. Maybe we should jump to the last one and talk about the First Amendment briefly. But yeah, that's the 64.
Slide.
Yeah, go to that one, First Amendment. Because the First Amendment is kind of a critical amendment to a lot of things, and it comes to mind in that comment. I mean, because ultimately the power of the United States vests in the people, right? We claim that we're the ultimate giver of the power. We just lend it to the government on our behalf. Mao said all political power comes from the barrel of a gun, which we don't have. You know, we have the Second Amendment, but we don't have tanks and aircraft carriers. And that's a whole nother question too. But I'd like to just kind of reflect a minute on the First Amendment, because it really has a cascade of rights, and it's very beautifully written. And I want you to just think about all that's in there. I've included it in my outline because I was going to talk about religious freedom and, you know, separation of church and state. But coming to the right of us to seek governmental redress, to think for ourselves, to believe what we want, is all in the First Amendment. And let's see. So just listen to this, and it's very short, and listen to the kind of the progression. It's almost like a poetic, I think, but the progression of rights that come forth in there and why they're all lumped together. There's got to be, you know, a traditional interpretation of constitutional language would say, well, why are all these rights together? There must be some purpose of that. Every word has meanings, as Mitch said. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So, you know, you kind of start with that, thinking about government's not going to establish a religion that tells you how to think or what to believe. In fact, you have the right to have free exercise of your ability to think for yourself and believe what you believe is right. And once you have those beliefs, you can talk about it. It's your right to speak freely, and to have a free press to publish and disseminate information throughout the country. Kind of that marketplace of ideas. They talk about that with First Amendment rights, that we have a free market of ideas, and the hope is that the best ideas percolate to the top, and those are the ones that people you like to think. And then, or the right of people to peaceably assemble, protest, to gather together, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. I just think that's a beautifully written amendment, and we should keep that in mind. And I don't know that it solves the problem when the president doesn't follow the Constitution, because then, what power is the Constitution once you start to ignore it? It's no longer the United States as it was founded. Briefly, those first two rights in the First Amendment also go to what I think is sort of the Christian nationalist movement, which I understand doesn't really think democracy is very convenient for it anymore, and thinks the Constitution is an impediment to its goals. But I think that the First Amendment is pretty clear that there's no governmental religion, and I think that means not just a preference for Christianity, but that the Christians aren't even favored, and that there's free exercise means free exercise of any religion and or no religion. So we can jump. I got a couple minutes left if you want to talk about the First Amendment, or if anyone wants to talk briefly about term limitations or impoundments.
Let me give our Zoomers a chance to jump in here, including Linda Daniel, who is a retired attorney also. Linda, would you like on anything here?
I just wanted to thank Jeff for bringing this forward, and I think we have lots to continue the discussion on, but my main concern right now is First Amendment being torn asunder and what individuals can do about it.
Question.
Well, one little thing in the news, and a lot of you keep more current on current events than I do, but the Supreme Court did just issue an opinion that struck down or affirmed a Court of Appeals order that made a religious charter school not constitutional because it violated but if you looked at below the first line of that, it was a 4-4 decision because one justice recused herself. So that's still always going to be a close subject, but that's one more piece of precedent, I think, in favor of enforcing the Establishment Clause rather than eroding it. So I'm happy about that. I think people should still need to exercise those First Amendment rights. Speak out. Support the press. That's something I've said. I think it's an easy one. Donate to CPR. Renew subscriptions to reliable, trustworthy news outlets and medias that need support more than ever. Assemble when we have the right. Go to whoever's in town. I've been to 3 different events.
Jim Vandermiller had a question too on Zoom. Then I'll come back to us folks. Jim, go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. I really appreciate this discussion, especially because I'm getting very, very interested in the Citizens United ruling. And I'm wondering if you could, if there is any way that comes to mind that the Supremes hung their hat on the First Amendment as far as Citizens United to grant personhood to corporations and to make money equivalent to speech. That doesn't seem like there's anything in the First Amendment that would allow that.
Yeah, there's one slide I think that had with all the cash flowing down over the dome, that I had Citizens United in mind when I picked out that slide. But there's a lot of, you had kind of a convergence of a broad definition of speech with also a broad traditional definition of personhood. There's been a long tradition that corporate entities have kind of all the rights of an individual and can do all of the things that a person can do. And so that's not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. I've kind of come to think of money isn't really speech, but it's more like a megaphone. It's a speech amplifier. It's not the speech itself. And I don't know if any of the Citizens United dissents or discussion differentiated it that way. It's been a long time since I've looked at any of the Citizens United, but I wasn't surprised so much by Citizens United, but I've been really, I think we all see the consequence of it now with the flood of money influencing our political system. So under the current makeup of the Supreme Court, I don't really see that being overruled. But maybe it should be re-examined. Are you aware of anything, Jim, that going on with that?
Well, no, I'm not aware of anything. I think that it has kind of slipped into some obscurity, but I really think it's one of the rulings that has come down in the last 15 to 20 years that has changed the whole nature of the democracy, because my understanding is that the framers were very, very concerned about the influence of money on the democracy, and that rich people would have an inordinate amount of power because of their wealth, and that this ruling has turned that idea on its head. But the one thing that gets me is that the establishment of personhood in a corporation was really a reach. The idea that corporations could contract and have limited liability to their shareholders was a right granted, as maybe I'm wrong about this, so feel free to correct me, a right granted by the king for exploration of the new world, and that to encourage investors to get involved in this thing, and by so doing grant the investors limited liability, and that somehow this got extrapolated to meaning that while the corporation was immune from prosecution, that it became a person. It didn't make sense to me. So,
Jim, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're about out of time, and I got to give you. It's okay. Good question. Thank you for bringing up money. Always a good question. I want to give real quick recognition to Ron had a question, and Hank, and then we got to go.
Just wanted to mention, USAID, of course, was essentially impounded. The organization has been effectively demolished. It's just a couple skeleton pieces left here and there. I believe the judiciary has ruled Trump had no right to do that impoundment, but it's sort of too late.
Yeah.
You've blown up the house, you've torn down the organization, and the judicial reaction was a couple of weeks late, and you can't really effectively rebuild that organization in any reasonable amount of time.
Good point. Hank, real quick, please.
Okay, Amendment 1 says Congress shall make no laws respecting and establishing religion, etc. However, if we consider executive orders as law, it gives the president a power to overrule Amendment 1.
What do you think, Jeff?
I don't think that argument will fly, but certainly someone's gonna run it up the flagpole.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, Karen?
The judiciary moving much more quickly.
Yes,
Things that used to take months and then weeks, and now they're turning things around in 24 hours.
that's right.
So they finally got a clue about the game that's being played, and I see them coming to the table, so.
I hope so, and I think they are, but I don't know in what they'll be bringing to the table.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for a great discussion today. Thanks, everybody. Ron will be presenting next week. Come back and join us.